Most of the SUVs people are queuing up to buy right now will need a new turbo, a new gearbox, or a new owner within 5 years. The 6 I'm about to show you won't. Nobody wants them. That's exactly why they're still running. Let's get into it. Number 1. The Mitsubishi Shogun, the Mark III and early Mark IV with the 3.2 DID engine. This is a vehicle that exists almost entirely outside of fashion. Nobody's ever bought one to be seen. Farmers buy them. Tow bar owners buy them. People hauling horse boxes up wet Welsh hillsides in February buy them, and then they keep them for 15 years because nothing goes wrong. The DID engine was built with an almost stubborn simplicity. No unnecessary electronics layered on top of the basics, a proper ladder frame chassis underneath, and a 4-wheel drive system that was engineered for actual off-road use rather than a marketing brochure. I've seen these past 300,000 miles with nothing more than routine servicing, still pulling trailers, still starting on the coldest morning of the year without hesitation. The one weak point worth knowing is the timing chain tensioner on certain years, which can rattle if neglected, so get that checked on any example you're considering. Beyond that, this is a vehicle that was never trying to impress anyone, and that's precisely why it's still working when the SUVs that were trying to impress everyone have long since been scrapped. You'll find these for well under £2,000 if you're willing to look past the tired interior and the mileage. The bodywork inside is where the money went. That's a trade worth making. There's also a secondary market truth worth knowing about the Shogun specifically. Because it's never been fashionable, parts remain cheap and plentiful. And because so many were bought by people who actually understood mechanics, the ones that survive tend to have genuinely honest histories. Nobody's polished up a neglected Shogun to flip it for a quick profit. The people who own these keep them because they work, and they sell them eventually, for the same reason everyone else avoided buying them in the first place. Number 2. The Land Rover Discovery 3, with the 2.7 TDV6, specifically avoiding the air suspension models if you want an easy life, and going for a car that's had the air suspension already converted to coil springs by a previous owner. I know the reputation. Land Rover electrics, Land Rover reliability jokes, all of it. Most of that reputation was earned honestly by the air suspension system and the electronic parking brake giving up at the worst possible moment. But the actual drivetrain underneath all of that, the TDV6 diesel and the transmission it's paired with, is a genuinely tough setup once you strip away the parts that were over-engineered for comfort rather than durability. Check the timing belt and water pump history carefully, because neglecting that interval is genuinely catastrophic on this engine, and inspect the chassis rails for rust before anything else. Get those 2 things right, and you've got one of the most underrated off-roaders in the country for the price of a second-hand caravan holiday. The irony with the Discovery 3 is that the very reputation keeping the price down is what makes it such good value once you know which specific example to look for. Most buyers see the badge, remember a story about an air suspension warning light, and walk away without ever asking whether that particular fault has already been solved. The car that scares off 90% of buyers is often only one part away, already replaced, from being one of the toughest things on the road. Number 3. The Hyundai Santa Fe, the second generation, with the 2.2 CRDI diesel. Nobody talks about these. They're not aspirational, they're not rare, they're not particularly attractive by most standards, and that combination of factors has kept the prices on the floor for years. But the CRDI engine in the second generation Santa Fe was built during a period when Hyundai was aggressively trying to prove itself in markets that didn't trust the brand yet, and that meant overbuilding rather than cutting corners. I've had these come through with 250,000 miles, still on the original clutch, still on the original turbo, the only real expense being routine cam-bolt changes done on schedule. The interior plastics have never been anything to celebrate, and the badge has never turned a head in a car park. But mechanically, this is one of the most consistently unremarkable, and therefore most reliable, diesels of its generation. Watch for injector issues if the service history shows any gaps, since neglected fuel filters can shorten injector life on this engine. And check that the 4-wheel drive system engages properly on a test drive, since a seized transfer case is the most common expensive fault. Outside of that, this is a 7-seat SUV that will do the school run and the driving holiday to Cornwall for the next decade, for less than the price of one new set of alloy wheels. What's genuinely striking about this generation of Santa Fe is how little anyone asks about it at auction. Dealers barely bid, private buyers scroll past it, and the ones that do sell tend to go for whatever the reserve happens to be rather than anything approaching a fair reflection of how well they actually perform. It's a car that's been quietly punished by a badge perception formed over a decade ago and never revisited since. Number 4. The Toyota RAV4, the third generation, with the 2.2 D4D engine, ideally the earlier version before the later DCAT emissions system complicated things. Toyota's reputation for reliability isn't marketing. It's earned, repeatedly, by engines like this one, which were designed with a level of conservative engineering that borders on paranoid. Nothing pushed to its limit. Nothing running hotter or harder than it needs to. Every tolerance built with margin to spare. I bought one of these 2 years ago from an elderly couple who'd owned it from new and simply stopped driving. 110,000 miles, full history, every single service done on time without exception, and the car started first turn of the key after sitting for 4 months. That's not an isolated case. It's what these engines do when they're looked after even moderately well, and often what they do when they're not looked after particularly well either. The only genuine concern on this generation is the DCAT variant's more complex emission system. So if you can find the simpler, earlier D4D without it, take that one every time. Beyond that, this is about as close to a guaranteed decade of trouble-free ownership as the used market currently offers. And almost nobody's bidding on them because the styling has never excited anyone. I've genuinely never had a customer come back unhappy with one of these, not once. That's not something I can say about most of the vehicles that pass through my hands, and it's precisely because Toyota built this engine with such caution that there's very little left for time or neglect to attack. A quick thought here, not a request, just an observation. Every one of these vehicles I'm talking about was ignored by buyers chasing something flashier at the time. That pattern isn't an accident. It's worth remembering next time you're the one doing the ignoring. Number 5, the Honda CR-V, the second generation, with the 2.2 ICTDI diesel. This engine gets overlooked constantly because Honda's reputation was built on petrol engines, and people assume the diesel unit must be some bolted-on afterthought. It wasn't. Honda developed this diesel properly, in-house, and it shows in how these things age. Smooth for a diesel of its era, genuinely economical, and mechanically tough in a way that's rarely given credit. I've seen these do 200,000 miles with nothing beyond consumables, clutches, brakes, standard servicing. The interior holds up remarkably well too, which isn't something you can say about most vehicles from this price bracket after 15 years of use. Nobody buys these because nobody talks about them, and nobody talks about them because Honda's diesel reputation never got the marketing push that the petrol side did. Watch for the intercooler pipes perishing with age, a cheap fix that's often neglected and can cause a loss of power if ignored, and make sure the timing chain hasn't been allowed to run dry on oil changes, since gaps in service history are the main predictor of problems here. Get a well-serviced example, and you've bought one of the quietest reliability stories in the entire used SUV market, for a price that barely registers as a purchase at all. Ask any Honda specialist mechanic privately, off the record, which diesel SUV from this era they'd trust, with a long motorway journey without a second thought. And this is very often the one they mention, quietly, almost apologetically, because nobody's ever built a marketing campaign around it. Number 6. And I've kept this one for last, because it surprises people every time I mention it. The Jeep Grand Cherokee, the WK generation, with the 3.0 CRD engine, sourced from Mercedes during the period when Jeep and Mercedes shared ownership and engineering resources. The Jeep badge in Britain carries almost nothing but skepticism. People assume American engineering, American electronics, American reliability standards, and dismiss it before checking under the bonnet. But the diesel engine in this particular generation isn't American at all in its origins. It's a Mercedes unit, related to the same CDI family found in genuinely respected Mercedes models of the same era, wrapped in a chassis that was, for its time, seriously capable off-road. I picked one of these up from an auction 18 months ago for £400, priced that low purely because of the badge and because the previous owner assumed a warning light meant something expensive. It was a sensor. £22. That vehicle has since covered another 15,000 miles without a single unscheduled repair. And every person who's seen it assumes it must be constantly breaking down, right up until I tell them the actual numbers. Check the electronics thoroughly on a test drive, since this generation did have some genuinely finicky wiring in places. But treat the engine itself with the respect a Mercedes diesel deserves, because that's precisely what it is underneath the American badge. It's worth sitting with that fact for a second. A vehicle sold under a rugged, distinctly American identity, powered by an engine built to German standards during a specific corporate arrangement that most buyers have completely forgotten ever existed. The badge tells one story. The service history and the engine block tell a completely different one. And the second story is the one that actually matters when you're the person turning the key every morning. 6 vehicles. All of them ignored. All of them capable of outlasting almost anything, currently sitting on a dealership forecourt with a 5-year finance plan attached to it. I should say something here that applies to all 6 of these, not just 1 or 2. Cheap doesn't mean neglected, and ignored doesn't mean unreliable. Those are 2 completely different qualities that people constantly confuse when they're browsing listings. A car can be worth nothing on paper and still owe nobody an apology mechanically. In fact, in this specific corner of the used market, that's closer to the rule than the exception. What actually determines whether one of these 6 turns into a brilliant purchase or a slow-motion disaster isn't the badge, and it isn't even really the mileage. It's whether the history is honest. A high-mileage example with full, unbroken service records, done by someone who understood the engine, will almost always outlast a low-mileage example that spent years sitting unused, seals drying out, fluids degrading quietly while the odometer stayed flattering. If you take one thing away from this list, take that. Buy the paperwork, not the number on the dashboard. If there's a single thread running through all 6, it's this. Every one of these was built during a window when the manufacturer was either trying too hard to prove itself or not trying hard enough to market itself. And either situation somehow led to the same result, an engine and chassis built to simply work, without anyone spending money making sure you noticed. That's a strange kind of accident when you think about it properly. None of these 6 vehicles were designed by committees trying to create a reliability legend. Nobody set out with a slogan in mind. They were built by engineers solving practical problems. Cheaply, without the budget or the incentive to cut corners on the one part of the car nobody was going to photograph. And decades later, that quiet, unglamorous decision-making is the entire reason these things are still on the road, while flashier competitors from the same era are long gone. Next time you're scrolling through listings and something boring, unfashionable, and slightly ugly catches your eye at a price that feels too low to be right, it might be worth a longer look than you'd normally give it. The car nobody wants is often the car that was never asking anyone to want it in the first place. And that's usually a far better sign than anything sitting proudly under a spotlight on a dealer's forecourt.